Module 5. Now we're really starting to approach the halfway point in the term, which is scary enough. And we're also approaching the point where your first assignment is due in. So we've got a few things to cover this week. And this is the last of the first batch of modules where we're really looking at the contextual issues around research. And from next module onwards, we're going to be looking in depth at actual different research sources and how you use them. Nevertheless, it's a very important one, and it's on the topic of research ethics. And like many of the other topics that we've dealt with in the first 5 weeks, it's been a real question of, well, which one do I deal with first? Because they're all really important. And if you are in a real research context, this is something you'd be doing at the very beginning, at the very start of the process. And in the readings and in the workshop this week, we're going to look at really two sides of the idea of research ethics. One is that idea of ethics as public good, and research as being something that engages with the public good for the public benefit. And the other is this idea of risk mitigation and risk management. And you'll find that there is a certain inconsistency at times when particularly organisations talk about research ethics. Are they talking about doing good, or are they talking about following the rules and not getting themselves into trouble? And as lawyers, I think that distinction is kind of interesting, that there is a real distinction between ethics being something that's about goodness, doing the right thing, or ethics being about avoiding someone suing you and avoiding getting into trouble. And one of the videos this week talks a little bit about that theme. In the workshop this week, we'll be looking at the actual process that the university uses for ethics application. But of course, as undergrad students, you won't be doing primary research of your own. You won't be going out there interviewing people and doing surveys and that sort of thing, largely because we haven't trained you to do that properly. Now, that's the sort of thing that you may well end up doing if you're an honours student, so it's important to know about these things to start with, and it's important to know about the procedures going ahead. But just to be completely certain about this, we're not expecting for your research assignments for you to actually engage in the outside world in any primary research. And in fact, there would be a real problem if you tried to do that, because you need to be able to obtain ethics clearance beforehand. But after this week, you should know a little bit more about why and what the processes for that actually are. And we'll work through this week, in the actual workshop itself, the university's low-risk ethics application process, and that's where you're not dealing with terribly potentially destructive forms of research. You're not cutting open anyone's brain or anything like that. But it would cover most of the research you would likely do, say, as an honours student, where you might want to go and survey members of the community, or you might want to send out a questionnaire of some sort. So in your portfolio for this week, we ask you to think about the ethical context of your research. Again, we're not expecting you to be doing that primary research, but you do also, I guess, want to think about the ethics around things like drink driving research, and the fact that anything that's dealing with criminality and people's legal rights requires some very, very careful, very sort of steady hands when you come to do that research. So any of the research that you'll be reading as part of the issues paper, or any of your own research that talks about programs and projects and findings, will have already been through this rigorous process. Because if you're dealing with people's criminal responsibility, you're dealing with the justice system, you're dealing with people suffering from addictions, various other factors, you've got to be very careful as to how you proceed. All right, so a couple of housekeeping tasks. Assignment 1, of course, is coming up soon, and it's been scheduled so that there is time for me to get comments back to you over the break, and I've given you a little bit of extra time in Moodle to do that, and I will be attempting to use my time in the best possible way to give you the most focused feedback. So I'm not going to be giving you editing. I'm not going to go through sentence by sentence and say you should have used that sentence or another sentence. I'll be liberally using grade marks audio function as well, so I can give you audio comments on your piece. But the premise of the piece is to actually give you an opportunity to get some feedback. It's not just about getting grade, it's about you getting some feedback on what you do. And I've had a few questions via email about this, and there's a certain phenomenon where I find, and I've been teaching for a long while now, and this happens all the time, is students want more and more details. And I'm often reluctant to give more details as time goes on, because people who are confused don't tend to get less confused with more information, tend to get more confused. And I've given a lot of guidelines on to how to answer the questions. You've got the rubrics and the way they're going to be assessed. And a few people are still quite confused about what it actually means. And I think one way to deal with this is to go back to basics and to go, well, what is this about? What is the point of this? The point of this is I need to give you some feedback on two things. One is your analysis. How are you approaching this? What is the unique feature of the way in which you're examining those questions that you've got? What do you think they mean? What are you going to discuss? So that's the analysis part of it. And the other part is the plan. How am I going to go about answering this? Not only in terms of planning my time, but organisationally and structurally and all those other things that, again, you've got guidelines on. And I think that people who are getting confused are getting focused on the micro, and they're focusing on those list of guidelines and thinking, well, the way to answer this is to go through each one of those things and to answer each of those questions in turn. Now, of course, this is a one page on each of these parts. Basically, 1,000 words is a page on one, page on the other. You don't have time to go through all those things and answer them in detail. It's really about going back to those basics and thinking, well, what's the context? What does Scott need? Scott needs to give an idea of what my analysis is, what my plan is, to give some feedback going forward. So I hope that helps. But of course, I guess in observance of the rule I laid out at the start, that's going to confuse people even further, I know. Even by attempting to simplify it. At the end of the day, I also think, and this is tied into some of the work we're doing on resilience, it is easy to let yourself get confused and to get yourself flustered and to get yourself worried. And if you don't have those resilience skills to go, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best. I've got what I've got before me, I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to see how it goes. And I think it's important to focus on that and not to think about all the things that possibly could go wrong. And I think that is a good skill base to go forward, not just in your studies, but in life. So if you find that anxiety and you find people are saying this and it's confusing you, whatever, go back to basics, but also think about, what are my resilience skills? Am I letting myself just get worried about this? When what I should be focusing on is, this is the task, I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to see what happens at the end of the day. And that's all we can ever do. Anyway, enough about the assignment. The readings this week are on the ethical background, and particularly there's the Australian Code of Responsible Conduct of Research, a very important document. Now, I'm not expecting you to read the whole thing and understand it all thoroughly, but I think you should have a general overview, an idea of what sort of things are covered in it. And the other thing, I think, is a complete side issue, is I think it's really worthwhile to think about what a code of conduct is as a set of rules compared to what legislation actually is, and how they're different and how they're similar. And to start thinking about those sorts of things, well, how do you govern behaviour? In some ways, you have the strong arm of legislation where you say, do this, or these are the legal consequences involved. But codes are a different way of getting people to voluntarily adopt a set of standards and putting themselves inside that system and voluntarily agreeing to adhere to them. And they may not necessarily have direct, overt consequences for individuals. But what they might mean is that individuals who don't play by those rules don't get to play in the same space as everyone else. And that's a different form of regulation. Maybe it's a more insidious form of regulation because you just exclude people rather than punish them. But it's a different way of approaching things. So I think just in terms of your development as legal theorists and your understanding of how law and regulation works, I think something like this code of ethics is something that's interesting, not just in itself, because it's very important in itself, but also in what it says about the way in which we regulate people in society. And finally, there's a few timely notes in the equilibrium section this week on being good to yourself and being good to your team, and how important it is to develop those ethical and positive work practices for yourself and for the people around you. And I think it's, as we are about to go into the halfway point of the term, it's a good time to remind yourself of those sorts of things, and to think about being an ethical researcher, being an ethical student, is about the way in which you relate to the rest of your learning community, and the way in which you take care of yourself, and you don't let yourself, and this gets back to the resilience perspective, you don't let yourself be harmed by the environment that you're in, and that you get alert to those sorts of things. You don't let yourself be someone who runs on stress and caffeine, because that's not going to be good for the people around you particularly, and it's not going to be good for you long term. So a good sense of equilibrium, a good sense of balance is also about being an ethical and resilient researcher, and it's going to be good for you, and it's going to be good for everyone else as well.